Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Think Bunker. My name is Painful Existence. I am alone again due to various reasons, and we are here today to talk about improvised armor and armored vehicles. Now, before we begin, to those of you who are new to the channel, thank you for viewing this video. We are glad that this video has reached you, first of all, and second of all, we are glad that you have stuck around and this video is of interest to you. If this type of content though does not pique your interest, we have differing variety content on our channel. We do cinematics, reenactments of events, and these kind of videos, more informative videos. If you are a returning viewer, welcome back. Thank you for sticking around. We love that you enjoy somewhat, or at least somewhat enjoy the content on this channel. With that out of the way, on to the presentation. So, the improvised armor stick starts in the First World War, and it is an enigma among warfare if you study it, because it's always present. No matter where you are, no matter what conflict, you will always have improvised armor somewhere. And even vehicles. Vehicles are not excluded to that. An example of this is in the 1980s in Afghanistan. There was a French FT used as a mobile machine, or rather, just a machine gun emplacement. You could say that's improvised, but you could say that's not improvised. It's just a vehicle they placed as armor, but I classified it as improvised because it's meant to be a transportable pillbox more than anything, really. But some of the most notable, I guess you could call it, examples of improvised armor is from the First World War, or roughly that era. If you look on top of the marked tanks you have in the background image and on the bottom left image, I believe those are cages, I believe, to stop artillery shells. I guess you could say they're early variants of the cope cage you saw in the Russia-Ukraine war. That's what I believe they are. I don't know exactly for sure. The theory is that the shells would detonate prematurely above the vehicle, but yeah, that's not going to stop it. And if it does, it's still going to kill a lot of people inside. Then you have the infamous tanker driver mask, which are in place to protect the drivers from shrapnel entering their face via chainmail and shuttered vision holes. The top left is the infamous Ned Kelly armor, an Australian man who, by the way, did not possess any facilities to craft such armor. The way this man did it was literally using a brush fire, getting the metal to a certain temperature so it could be molded, and just smacking it with a hammer for long periods of time. He heated it up just to the point when the armor could be folded, or not folded, shaped after a lot of smacking it with a hammer. And there it is. Ned Kelly. And then at the bottom there, at the last image not discussed, is the what's known as the lobster shell, or I believe crab armor. It's just basically Ned Kelly armor, but more dexterous because of the folding plates. The reason why this goes back to medieval time, the reason why you would make not folding plates, but rather linked plates, is so that if you're, say, jumping a barricade, or you're squatting down, your armor isn't blocking you from crunching your abdomen. You can still maneuver your abdomen with this armor on, while still being provided protection. Moving on, you then get to the vehicle section with improvised, just homemade vehicles. That is, I believe, an FT. No, I don't. That is not an FT. Excuse me, that is incorrect. But regardless, these are just tracked vehicles that they've welded on armor, cannons, anti-air guns. I believe that truck there is just an anti-air gun with a with extra armor provided to protect the crew members of the tank. Needless to say, things get very wacky when people get desperate. I mean, how do you think the Hunley came about with the Confederacy? We move to the knee tanks. The knee tanks in the shipping yard of Odessa had a tank factory. Now, this tank factory was very limited, uh, and what they did was they, similar to another vehicle we're about to talk about, they took an old tractor chassis, brought out a bunch of heavy boilerplates and naval armor, and they welded it to the a frame built on the tractor chassis. The Soviets were defending Odessa from the German advance, and in their desperation, unlike Kursk, where they just hung a bunch of tanks in the window of a manufacturing factory, they just decided to let's just make our own tanks, and slapped on a bunch of metal plates and a rotating turret for a machine gun into the frame of a tractor, or rather a you could say extended frame of a frame added onto the chassis of a tractor. These were essentially just built to have armor in the field. It was something rather than nothing. And well, I mean, in theory, it could work. It's at least your infantry have something to charge behind or hide behind when machine guns start firing. Uh, what happened to these after the war, or rather after their service in Odessa? The Soviets simply just the Soviets didn't do anything with these things because they were captured by the Germans, who just converted them back into tractor chassis, or just scrapped them, used them for metal for their own vehicles. And also the Soviets that actually had some of these in service, who had retained them at the fall of Odessa, they just simply same thing, scrapped them or converted them back into tractors. Which brings us neatly along to our next vehicle, the Bob Semple. Very similar, actually. In fact, almost the exact same background, just in a different part of the country. Now, the circumstances behind this vehicle are bizarre. Or not so bizarre. The Australians and the New Zealanders were wary of the Japanese army's encroachment on their waters. In fact, several ships had been spotted, and they feared a landing attempt would be made on the New Zealand and Australian homeland. This is why a bunch of American, or rather an allotment of American infantry, were sent to bolster the ranks and the forces of the Australians when America officially joined the war, that is. And in fact, sent aircraft carriers from the Pacific Fleet to guard them against the Japanese Navy at some points. Now, the Aussies and the New Zealanders actually relied on the British Empire, the Crown's military, to provide them armored vehicles, of which Britain would not be able to. On top of the fact that most of the British tanks were lost at Dunkirk, the British Navy had to have every gun looking for a German ship or U-boat and sink it. The Australians were just out of luck, and America was busy procuring and developing its own armored systems, tanks, aircraft, and building aircraft carriers to fight the Japanese. So the Aussies and the New Zealanders for a while were a bit out of luck. Thus, an idea was born. Bob Semple himself, who previously led, I believe it was called the Black Party in Australia, the Mining Party in Australia, who then fled to New Zealand. Unlike the Australians, instead of doing nothing, decided to build something. This is, again, refers back to the theory of it's better than is something is better than nothing. And much like the Soviet knee tank, built on an old tractor chassis, or rather an extension, a frame built on top of a tractor chassis, constructed this. Machine guns on most sides, if not all, actually. Actually relatively well covered with using Bren guns and a turret. The turret was originally planned to, if possible, house an American 37mm cannon. As mentioned earlier, this would not come to fruition. It was presented to the New Zealand ministry, to the New Zealand, I guess you could say Ministry of Defense or their equivalent thereof. Not exactly accepted. They paraded this in the streets of New Zealand with plenty of political opponents of Bob Semple laughing at it and saying this hunk of junk's not going to protect us. But, well, again, Bob Semple's response was, well, something is better than nothing. And to that, I'd say he's right. This man took, and of course, I've had this discussion when Kento was with us before he left. We had this discussion of that the Bob Semple was not an improvised vehicle because there were plans of production, which yes, there were. However, this I would classify as improvised because it was built out of a situation where what do we have? Oh, we have riveters, a tractor chassis, and some corrugated sheet metal. Perfect. Let's see what we can do. That is improvised by definition. Moving on. Real quick, before, much like the knee tanks, these things are just decommissioned, scrapped, or more likely just deconstructed back to regular tractors. So, these things actually, unlike the knee tanks, never saw combat. For obvious reasons. A lot of issues plagued it, much like the knee tanks, that it was overbearing. The weight was overbearing. It just has so many automotive issues. I mean, you're asking a lot out of a tractor chassis. Good effort, but it's just, again, something's better than nothing. Moving on, we have civilian less than legal. On the left is the infamous Killdozer. The backstory behind this basically is that a man was so fed up with his community that he, much like a Soviet or knee tank or a New Zealand Bob Semple tank, armored up a bulldozer and wreaked havoc on a city or a town with no guns on it, though. Yeah, he was, I believe the police put a grenade down the exhaust pipe of the vehicle, which caused it to shut off for many reasons. Obvious reasons. And that was it. Yeah. On the right is the image of, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, according to my sources, this vehicle was built by the Syrians during the Russian invasion of Syria, where the Syrian military, as resources became more scarce, these guys welded together some plates onto a vehicle chassis and was essentially using it as a discount armored personnel carrier. That's what that is. I don't know the success of this vehicle, and that's all the reliable information that I have on it. Moving on, we then have technicals. Toyota is infamous for these, but Ford and GM aren't so innocent in this. Also, you have the infamous Doom cannon in the back. That is a black powder cannon, by the way. I just want to point that out. Technicals come in various and varieties, and a variety of just variants, most of which most of which are the basic 50 cal in the back of a Toyota, to the missile carrier or rocket ATGM carrier, rocket carrier, or anti-air variant to shoot down helicopters. These are, again, another antithesis of the statement, something is better than nothing. And, I mean, hey, instead of just having a bunch of Iraqi infantry or ISIS infantry shooting at you with AKs, you can have one with a cannon on the back of it. Yeah, technicals are just an overall term for a civilian vehicle modified with military weapons. That is the definition that I know well. or not know well, but that I know. That might not be the official definition, is what I'm trying to say, but you get the picture. This is a technical. Take notes. Um, Fun story. My dad, who served in the army for 20 years in logistics, he noted that at one point they would have these trucks with mortars, where what they would do with these trucks, they were crew cab trucks, meaning the doors would open. They would open on the front and back of the cabs, so they both swung out where each other met. And what they would do, they'd have these door mortars, and they drive up, stop, open the door, the mortar would fall out, drop a mortar in, the mortar would fire, pull it back in, close the doors, and leave. Yet once the blue forces actually caught up to those guys, it didn't end well for them. Also, I just like to point out in the bottom left image of the screen, you see the man with the turret on the back of the technical. Make of that what you will. Moving on. Now, I'd like to point out before we continue that this whole brief is very short because there's just not much to talk about, and there's not much to. I do not like repeating myself. Basically, improvised armor is improvised armor. Improvised vehicles are just you take a vehicle and you make it into something else, or rather, it's improvised armor, as in this right here, add-on armor. On the back image, you have the image in the background is a Stuart. I cannot tell what variant. It could be an M3A3 or an M5. I think it is an M5. I believe it's an M5 with logs and sandbags put on it. This was not uncommon during the Second World War. On the image to the top left is tracked Shermans. This is not just restricted to American vehicles or Shermans specifically. They're just more famous on Shermans. They would put tracks on the front of the vehicle to help try to bolster the thickness. On the top right is what I call a Sherman Skirtchen. I used to think that the American tank crews would rip off Panzerskirchen off of German Panzer IVs or Panzer IIIs and weld that to their tanks. But I think this was an actual not a production thing, however, rather a thing where it was improvised. They saw the German side skirts and go, oh, those are effective, and slapped them on the sides. I think mainly they were really meant, the best they could do is stop a shaped charge or heat round, but not much else. On the bottom left is the infamous concrete Sherman, enough said, and on the bottom right are sandbags. These would oftentimes be associated and served alongside logged Shermans. Now, the biggest question to ask yourself is improvised armor worth it? Does the trade-offs of improvised armor outweigh the cost, or do the benefits outweigh the cost? Well, let's take a look at the benefits. Effectively, you have slightly thicker armor. What do I mean by this? Well, obvious to someone who may think, well, concrete's gonna work better because it's so thick, it's heavy. Well, yeah, but concrete splits at high impact forces, and you're being shot with high velocity shells. It's just gonna shatter. Well, what about tracks? They're essentially 20 millimeters thick. Yeah, but they're soft steel and rubber. Effectively, that's only about 8 millimeters extra. Panzerskirchen. That's not going to stop. Okay, yeah, a Panzerfaust won't go through that. But pretty much everything else will. And then finally, you have sandbags. The theme here is that improvised armor a lot of times doesn't do you well. There are some instances where they do. On Humvees during the U.S. war in the Middle East, before the U.S. officially issued underplate protection to Humvees from IEDs, they would place armored plates underneath the Humvees to protect them from IEDs. Those were relatively successful. A lot of times were actually very successful in the fact that it would just direct the blast away from the underside of the Humvee, killing the crew inside. But against most other things, the Humvee, it's not going to protect them much. With these, and with all that said, I cannot, I cannot. The examples on screen here with the American vehicles emphasize the point more than anything else. The trade-offs are you have a vehicle that weighs more, is more sluggish, and for what? Slightly more protected armor. This just makes you a this just makes you more of a target, keeps you in the enemy sightline for longer, and hinders your ability to perform. And yet, a shot that would have penetrated you before the armor is still going to penetrate your armor after you add on this extra armor. So overall, add-on improvised is typically not advised, and this is why. I mean, seriously, the Second World War goes crazy with this kind of stuff. Thank you for watching. As I stated earlier, this was going to be a short brief due to the fact that of all of these slides from the First World War, homemade German vehicles, knee tanks, Bob Semple, civilian less than legal, technicals, and add-on armor, there's one thing to take away from this. It's improvised armor. Improvised, the basic definition or practical definition of improvised armor is essentially, or improvised vehicles for that matter, is either for improvised vehicles, it's a vehicle that you have converted to serve another purpose with, say, less than production worthy resources. Essentially, what you found lying around placed on top of another vehicle, and it serves a completely different purpose. Think the Soviet knee tanks and the Bob Semple tank from earlier. Improvised armor is just, again, it's very similar. The vehicle still serves the same purpose, but you don't, you place materials that you just have lying around, and you just place them on a vehicle, i.e., technicals or the add-on armor that you see in the Second World War. That is what improvised anything on vehicles are, and overall, in very rare cases, are they actually effective. Most of the time, they're just detrimental to the vehicles that they are. Most of the time, they are detrimental to the industry or to the force that is using them. The only example I would say of where they're successful is with the Soviet knee tanks and the Bob Semple, where something, literally anything, is better than none. With that said, if you are a returning viewer, thank you for watching this. If you are a first-time viewer, I hope that this kind of content intrigues you. And as such, our focus here at the Think Bunker is to portray history in the most accurate depiction of which we know possible. We have different kinds of content on our channel, shameless self-promotion. With that said, this is Painful Existence. The brief is over. Now get back to work. Time is money, and I'm broke.